Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm Cody Goodwin here, joined by our senior writer, John Talty. And John, I have a question for you. How much do you think Bryant-Denny Stadium charges for rent? Because the Texas defensive line was living in Alabama's backfield all night last night.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into a lot here about that loss, but I would say that's the area that I think is both most concerning and also, I think if you're a fan, the most disappointing because there's just been so much talk, not just from outside experts who I like and respect, but inside that room, inside that building, inside that position group of what they're going to do this year. And I think it led to heightened expectations because for 2+ years now, the offensive line has not been great. They've kind of lived off their rep, and this year felt like they're actually going to be good. And they got pummeled, they got mauled, whatever words you want to use. It happened to them, and there was really, I mean, go back and watch the game after. We'll see. Maybe J.C. Latham probably had the best day of the group, but it was just bad pretty much across the board. Darian Dalcourt had a rough day, multiple penalties that he had, let some points coming off the board. Seth McLaughlin, I don't know what was happening there with some of those snap penalties and botched issues, and Proctor got worked a few times. It was just a mess, and I think that's something that, I think we've talked about on this show previously. Like, I want to see how they play against a real test. We knew Texas was going to be really good defensive line. Let's see how they handle it. And in a pass-fail world, they absolutely failed last night.
Yeah, at the very least, very hard to assign a passing grade to the offensive line. We're recapping Alabama's 34-24 loss to Texas last Saturday, drops the Crimson Tide to 1-1 overall. First home loss since 2019 against that loaded LSU squad. First non-conference home loss since 2007. So pretty jarring loss all the way around, but I'm in agreement with you. The offensive line, I think, was kind of the biggest thing that stuck out because of how bad they were. And this was something that we kind of knew coming in. Texas defensive front, they're good. Like Tavondre Sweat, Ethan Burke. They had a true freshman, Anthony Hill, who picked Texas over Alabama. He flashed last night with a couple of sacks, including one that basically ended the game. I know that there's a lot of other things that we'll get to because there was a lot of things that Alabama did poorly last night. But it starts up front. And coming from an offensive line or coming from a unit, like you mentioned, they talked about wanting to make people quit. And J.C. Latham talked about going undefeated and winning the Joe Moore Award. They had a stage with 100,000 people at Bryant-Denny with millions more watching around the country, and they did none of that. Like they got beat. Texas sent all kinds of pressure, whether it was just the four guys rushing, whether they sent blitzes. There was one sack where I think they only sent three guys. It was not a good performance. It was not good, and it kind of set the tone for really an Alabama offense that just they struggled, and it was so confusing to watch them struggle. And we'll get into this, but it really starts with that offensive line. They weren't great. Texas racked up 28 total pressures in addition to 5 sacks, in addition to 4 hits. I think it was like Milroe looked all out of sorts. It was bad. It was really bad. And that was, I mean, I'm kind of glad we're in agreement. I know we were talking about it last night in the press box, but the prevailing takeaway was just that knew it was going to be a challenge for Alabama to hold up against Texas defensive front. And they did not do it. They didn't do it last night, plain and simple.
Yeah. And, we can get into Milroe, and there are some things that, I think he's just a roller coaster, and I think that's, if you've ever been on a roller coaster, sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's bad. And I think that's kind of the Jalen Milroe experience, like that. Those 2 interceptions are 2 of the worst interceptions I've seen. Just terrible throws, locked in on a guy and just does it. And then, that touchdown pass to Jermaine Burton was beautiful. And so he's just going to be up and down. But I think why I put more blame on the offensive line than Jalen is that, to your point, watching him, he was just never able to get comfortable. There was not a lot of time to work back there. I don't think his receivers did much for him. Again, this is a first watch. We'll rewatch it and see what things pop. But on first watch, there weren't a lot of things for him to do. And so when that pocket's collapsing fast, and there was a couple times where I can remember one play where, I mean, Proctor just got blown up like immediately, and Miller had a guy on him in a second. There's just not much you can do there. I mean, he's athletic, and I think he was able to do the best he could, but he's not, he's just going to be somewhat limited in general. And so when the offensive line does no favors up front, it just makes it even harder. Bryce Young had those problems last year too. And Bryce Young was taken number 1 in the NFL draft for a reason. Jalen Rowe is not going to be taken number 1 in the draft. And so we all kind of wondered about, with that margin of error getting a lot slimmer, how things would work out. And what we saw against Texas is that it's going to be hard, that they don't have a guy who can save them the way that Bryce saved them many times over the last couple of years. And it's just going to take offensive line, is going to have to improve significantly. And it's, again, we could spend all day talking about all the issues, because outside of Will Reichert, I think almost everything was not great against Texas. But there's just a lot of things you can nitpick about that effort, because I think, Texas outplayed them in so many different ways. And the scariest thing to me, if I were an Alabama fan, is not just the fact that they got outplayed, but Texas just looked like the better team. I mean, if you thought about the guys who would scare you, and Alabama used to scare teams, if you thought about the guys who used to scare you, who do scare you, the top 3 or so guys on offense are all in Texas. And the top 3 or so guys on defense might all be on Texas too. And that, to me, is the difference from what we used to see from Alabama, a field of alphas who, Sark talked about, used to scare teams when they walked in. I don't think teams are scared of Alabama anymore. And you saw Texas take it right to them.
Yeah, no, it 13-6 at halftime, and it didn't feel like it was that close, just kind of watching the game. I mean, Alabama came out and they played pretty well to start. Like, they established the run. The offensive line was getting some push. They had like 65 rushing yards in the first quarter, and then they had 73 for the rest of the game. So it's like, what happened? 28 pressures from Texas defense against Alabama on 39 dropbacks. Like, if it felt like Milroe was on the run for the entire game, it's because he was. Like, you mentioned not being able to get into a rhythm. He finished 14-27 for 255, 2 touchdowns, also another 70 rush yards, but also threw 2 horrible interceptions that I wouldn't put on the offensive line. But, the lack of a rhythm because of the offensive line, like, he's rolling out of the pocket. He's looking to pass first. One question that maybe popped into my head again on the first watch, maybe we'll learn a little bit more on the rewatch, but I kind of wanted to pose this to you. The offensive struggles, I think, start with the offensive line, but how much of this maybe is also on the coaching staff and Tommy Rees for not maybe developing a game plan to, one, maximize Milroe's strengths, which is obviously his feet, but then also like to try and mitigate Texas's defensive front a little bit. Like, why not get this guy out on some rollouts that kind of give him a run pass option a little bit? Or, it didn't seem like Proctor got a ton of chip help. Not that it really mattered. I think a ton of the pressure came up through the middle. You mentioned McLaughlin struggling with a couple of penalties. Dalcourt had a penalty that drew back a touchdown. Like, there was all sorts of issues, but why didn't it seem like that the coaching staff helped him out a little bit? I feel like there were ways to maybe mitigate it a little bit, and I just don't think we saw any of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that, that's something that I'd like to, hear more from, Nick Saban too, just as they watch the film and see, some of those issues. But I mean, sometimes it's overly simplistic to think about it this way, but just having watched the Sark era at Alabama and just watching how they performed. And again, it's not apples to apples, because I think Quinn is at this point a significant upgrade over Jalen as a quarterback, but just the interesting play design, just getting guys in motion, just mixing it up, trying to keep Alabama off balance. And you could tell, whether it's slowing it down or then going hurry up, Alabama's defense had problems with it. And it didn't feel like there was a lot of that from Alabama. I mean, I'll give Tommy Rees credit. There were a couple plays that I thought were kind of, fun play designs. There was that one, I think it was Jason McCullough, who felt like if Jalen hit him in stride, that's a touchdown. I thought that was kind of a nice little design there. But overall, you would have liked to have seen more. And I think you see stories. I know Peyton Manning's talked about this, that like the halftime adjustment thing is kind of overrated and it doesn't really happen as much as you think. But so even if that said, and not to come off dumb, but like you just kind of wish you saw something different in the second half. And I didn't really feel like we saw a lot of that. And, we'll see. We'll see what the reaction is to. It is kind of funny, and just that, you know, Alabama fans they're going to go back and forth on what they like, and they used to hate some of the stuff Bill O'Brien did, and there was a lot of the run the damn ball mantra, and they ran the ball a lot last night, and yeah, there it is, and it worked at times, but I think it's hard to be a one-dimensional team, and it felt like it was either a Jalen Milroe deep ball that worked, a couple times, or it felt like a lot of times it just felt like a lot of 2-yard runs, trying to get to the edge, not being able to do it, trying to get through the middle, doing it every once in a while, but not a lot. And so I just think it's going to be a challenge for Alabama if Tommy Rees can't figure out different ways to, like you said, utilize Jalen. And I do wonder if part of the problem is, and I pointed this out last week against Middle Tennessee State, is that like some of Jalen's kind of like cross field throws, like they just seem to lack zip. And I just wonder if they just don't trust him on some of these shorter, intermediate things that Sark used to do, at Alabama. And we saw with Quinn Ewers last night, just some of the things he did. I just wonder if Tommy just doesn't trust Jalen to be able to hit those throws.
Yeah, I don't know. Like it was really confusing, especially after the first quarter. Again, 65 rush yards, like they were averaging 5 yards a pop. Like they were, I don't know if it was just Jace McClellan running his tail off or the offensive line was just getting a lot of push. Again, I'll probably rewatch it and we'll see kind of what that was in the first quarter. But I figured okay, they're establishing the run. Let's see a little bit of that 12 personnel that we saw a lot of in the first week. And, establishing the run, right, it allows you to open up play action that allows to, that's going to keep the Texas defense guessing. Gets the tight ends involved, and that just there was just a lot of confusing things. So one of the things I'm really curious to ask Saban about on Monday is just what'd you learn from the film compared to the game plan, and what can you do better moving forward? Because Milroe played erratically. The offensive line was horrible, and I just don't know that he got a lot of help. And which is funny because one of the bright spots I thought, again on first watch, I don't think the receivers were all that bad yesterday. Maybe one drop, maybe
No, I don't think drops were a problem. I think there were times where it felt like, nobody was necessarily, getting open. But I mean, yeah, Burton should have had 3 touchdowns, right? 2 of them came called back. Isaiah Bond made some tough catches. I feel like Kobe Prentice made some tough catches. I think Malik Benson might have had one kind of contested catch. So yeah, I think that they did what they could in that regard. And I think one of the tricky things moving forward, Cody, is, and Saban's not going to straight up say this or admit this, but they're going to keep hammering the execution. But at some point you wonder, is this a talent issue? And that's kind of the way that I'm leaning a bit, where again, with just Texas just felt like a more talented team. And there's not going to be many others on the board that you can say that about. But if they have to play Georgia at the end of the season, Georgia's going to be on paper a more talented team. And just a certain point, you just wonder, I think Jalen Miller tries really hard, but is he just limited ceiling wise? And is that something that they're going to keep bumping into, where as much as they talk about, wanting to execute, and Saban's, they're practicing this a million times. So it's not like the time and effort isn't there, but sometimes you're just limited by your abilities.
Yeah. No, I'll be curious to kind of see what the ultimate lessons are from a game like this and how they're able to maybe structure the offense a little bit more. Week 2 is, again, it's not the end, and you hit on it. The rest of the schedule isn't going to feature teams that are as talented as the Texas team we saw last night. It's funny. I watched their first game against Rice, talking about the Longhorns, and that version of Texas I didn't think was this amazing team. It definitely wasn't the version of Texas we saw last night. The version of Texas we saw last night is absolutely a playoff contender. Just a super, super impressive performance overall. Real quick on the flip side of things, talking about Milroe playing erratically and just under pressure almost all game. Quinn Ewers had a fantastic game, mostly because he was kept clean. Virtually, Alabama's pass rush was virtually non-existent. Again, another one of those things that we're going to have to go watch, what's the rewatch, what exactly happened. Didn't see a ton of Dallas Turner. Didn't see a ton of Chris Braswell. Didn't see a ton of Jaheim Otis. Maybe 5 pressures, if that, 0 sacks. I know initially on the first watch, I saw Dallas Turner was getting doubled a lot, but Quinn Ewers is one of those guys where, and similar a little bit to Milroe. Like if you keep them clean, they play better. That's generally the rule with most quarterbacks. And Ewers was kept clean virtually all night last night, and it showed because he played really well. We saw that last season. Even though Alabama snuck out a 20-19 win, when Ewers was in the game, he was kept clean and he played really well. I'm curious, like there's fault on the defensive side of the ball as well, even though I would largely argue that the defense was a big reason why Alabama was even in that game in the third quarter. But just the lack of communication in the secondary, the lack of a pass rush, like there was a lot of 2022 tendencies cropped up all throughout the Alabama team, but especially defensively against Texas last night. What did you think of the defensive performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think you hit on a lot of the main issues. I mean, and Saban said after the game that, I mean, they just didn't affect Quinn at all, and that's not what you want. You don't want a guy who can throw a beautiful pass having the time to really sit back there and set it up. That's a really big challenge, especially for your secondary. I think that they made some mistakes, some guys got beat, but as a whole, I thought they were pretty strong. But I mean, it's I think being a cornerback and safety is probably the hardest jobs in football. It's just such a challenging thing. And so the more time that you give them to figure it out and do something different, just the harder it is, the more pressure it puts on your cornerbacks. And it was interesting to see them go after Kool-Aid a bit, but I mean, it's been an ongoing issue. I know we've talked about it on our boards. We've written about it. Like, you think about, again, these dominant Nick Saban teams, and they had some just absolute maulers up front. There were some years where, I mean, they had guys who have turned out to be very, very good NFL players, and they were like 8 on the depth chart. It was just incredible, the talent that they had, and just the guys they were able to rotate. And I mean, did anybody have a big impact? I didn't think so. I mean, we hyped up Jaheim Otis a lot this offseason. Has he made a major impact so far? I haven't seen it. I mean, I don't think there's really a dude up front right now, and I think that's a major concern. And I think that they made the decision, it seems like, to drop guys back in coverage more. But looking back on it, I wonder if there was if there was maybe a little regret about not being more aggressive. They tried a couple times. There was at least one or two, I think, inside linebacker blitzes. I remember bringing Caleb Downs down at one point to blitz, and I still don't know if we know an answer about what happened, why he didn't, why he wasn't playing. Maybe we'll get that from Saban on Monday, but it's just a major issue when you can't get pressure up front. I mean, it's just simple. I mean, there's a reason why at the NFL level, it's so prioritized. It's why those guys make a lot of money, because if you can't get pressure up front, you have to just start adding more and more bodies to the mix to try to get it. And then that leaves less guys in the back. If you have 4 great defensive linemen or 3 great defensive linemen, then you can drop more guys back in coverage. I mean, sometimes I don't pretend to be a football expert, but sometimes it's kind of simple. And to me, it just feels like if you don't have guys up front who can get home, which it feels like they did not do that against Texas. They'll probably look better against South Florida, but when they play better teams down the line, it'll continue to be an issue. That just puts more pressure on having to bring more guys up. And, I think that just led to some of the issues we saw. And there's no easy fix there. There really isn't, because I think that they just have not done a great job recruiting that position the last couple of years. And that's an issue as well. I mean, it's Cody, we can go back to, some of our roundtables. I think we all hinted on like defensive line, depth, all that. Like, all of us indicated it as a potential issue. And after 2 weeks, it is an issue.
Yeah. You look at what are the premium positions in football today: quarterback, defensive line or edge rusher of some capacity, and receiver. And Texas, from a talent perspective, whipped Alabama in all 3 of those last night. Yeah. Like, they had the better receivers and they had a stable of them. I don't care how many good defensive backs you have. When you got to cover Worthy and Whittington and Mitchell and Jatavion Sanders, like, I was kind of curious how they were going to handle that with, because last year Texas had Bijan Robinson, which demanded a lot of attention from the defense. You don't have a Bijan on the other side that you got to worry about, but you do have 4 elite pass catchers that you got to figure out how to put the clamps on. And Alabama did not do that. Quarterback, like, if Milroe's kept clean, does he play better? hard to tell. Those, I wouldn't put pressure on, the two interceptions he had. I wouldn't put that on the, Texas pressure as much as those were just bad decisions.
All right, I agree.
Yeah, and then the defensive front, like we talked plenty about how Alabama's offensive line just didn't look good last night. So it's, I like you said, sometimes it is that simple. Like we can dig into it, and I'm sure I'll probably write 2,000 words on the rewatch after I finally get through it. But like it's, sometimes it is that simple. And, even with all that said, like Alabama had opportunities to win this game and didn't. And that's, the reasons they didn't, I think, is the reason to worry about this team moving forward, right? Like the offensive line, the lack of execution. Like there were two penalties that brought back touchdowns. You mentioned Dalcourt, the illegal man downfield, and then Caden Proctor got tagged for holding. The receivers, like I think maybe like we saw a little bit of clarity when it came to receivers. Bond made a good catch. Nyblack's just picking up, I think, the most targets out of the tight end room. Jermaine Burton had a really, really good game, even though 2 of his touchdowns got called back. But like I don't know. We're kind of bouncing all over the place right now, but it was a weird performance, and it was not a great performance. And I think it was kind of telling that, not only was Texas just a better team, but they were significantly better at the very key positions that matter when it comes to winning in today's game.
And do you know what I think was telling too was just how Texas ended that game. I mean, that felt like a classic Alabama way of winning a game where they know you're running the ball and you're just going to run it down their throats over and over and over again. And they burned 7 minutes in that game. I mean, I went down to the field and it's like, all right, Alabama's about to get the ball. We'll see what they do. I don't know. They got another first down. We're about to get the ball. It just kept happening. And eventually it's like, wait a second, the game's about to end. And it was shocking to me, really, being on Texas' sideline. And I think even they were kind of shocked that like it just kept working. And that is concerning to me from an Alabama standpoint. And is that them kind of giving up a little bit? Is that them just being physically outworked? I mean, it probably maybe some combination of the two, but that's not something that happens to Alabama very often. And there was a lot, and I know Cody, you've done a lot of work to understand this team, but still a little new to the game. But like last night is just unusual in many ways. It's the worst home loss Saban has had from a point differential standpoint. Again, not having lost to a non-conference team since 2007. And just the way that they lost at the end of that game, it's just, I can't remember many Alabama games ending that way. So just a weird night. And even the game, I mean, this ended up not really mattering, but I mean, there was a stretch where you had the, almost fumble, almost kind of like butt fumble type thing. Then they gave the ball back. And then like, Quinn Ewers threw a pass that got deflected and he caught it and ran. I mean, it just got weird at times. And I don't know. I think it's gonna be a fascinating rewatch for you because I can just remember in the moment feeling like this is just a bizarre game. And it reminded me of the 2015 Alabama Ole Miss game, which was also very bizarre. And, if you're going to take the most optimistic look moving forward of this team, that was also the earliest I can really remember Alabama losing in a season. They ultimately figure out their quarterback position. They win a national championship. They were probably the most limited talent team of a Nick Saban team to win a national championship, but they figured it out. Like that loss is what crystallized different things for them. They figured out their identity moving forward, all those different things. So if you want to be an optimist, that to me is the path forward. But that team also had Derrick Henry on it, and he's pretty good.
Yeah, he's not bad. Yeah, no, that stretch you were talking about, like in the third quarter, like, Alabama scores 10 points. They ended up taking the lead, right?
Yeah.
Like they 16-13, and we're all just kind of like, what in the world? Like the defense kind of took that quarter to basically turn the game into a rock fight a little bit. Like I was like stunned, but I was also impressed. Like I cracked a joke in the press box. I was like, I thought I left these Big Ten games, back in Iowa. Like it was borderline ugly. You start to realize it's like, okay, like maybe this is what Alabama has to do if they're going to win this game. And then they take the lead. And then 6 plays later, Texas has a 2-possession lead, right? Like they go down the field and they score to take the lead back. Milroe throws a second pick, and then very next play, boom. So 16-13 to 27-16, just like that. And I was like, okay, like this, that was the auto correction, right? Like there was no way that Texas has, with the talent that they have on the roster, there was no way they were going to let the game stay ugly for that long, right? Like it was almost impressive the way Alabama had just slowed the game down through the third quarter. And then come the fourth quarter, Texas cracked it back open. And it kind of went the way that, at least through the first half, we all thought it might.
I was incredibly impressed by that stretch by Texas because, and I think, because it was just such a weird game, and the halftime, it's like they should probably be down multiple touchdowns. They're only down one score. They're hanging around. And when they went up, I think I turned to Rodak. Was like, this feels like it's a game that Alabama's going to win, because being at home, I mean, the crowd was electric at times, and Texas did a good job, I think, of taking it out. But the crowd was very loud, one of the better crowds that I've seen in Bryant-Denny, and it just felt like Milroe has his kind of moment. The crowd is going wild. And that, again, I've seen plenty of teams crumble in Bryant-Denny under those scenarios. And for Texas to just be like, nah, we got this, and to do what they did in response to that says a lot, I think, about that team's resolve and mettle, that they could go on the road and go down and still put that team away. It says a lot about the talent they have. I think it says a lot about the job that Sark has done in Texas, that he's been able to kind of finally get them to this moment.
Yeah, no, they came out swinging, they came out punching, and they, even when Alabama punched back, Texas got right back up, got right back in the ring, and just kept going. It was really impressive to watch, and you could tell early on that, like, okay, like this Texas team is here to fight, and they are not going to go home, without leaving it all out there. It was really impressive to watch. I guess in the way of spinning this forward a little bit, I mean, you mentioned that Alabama has had seasons before where they've lost early. They have figured things out, and they end up having, really, really good, even championship seasons. I'm kind of curious for you, after watching last night, what's a big question or two that you have for Alabama moving forward? What do they need? What do they need to do? What's the first thing you would address if you were Saban?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we hit on a lot of issues here, but to me, I think the offense is still the bigger concern. And I think they need to figure out what they want to be, and I think that I wouldn't be surprised, probably was going to happen either way. But, I think playing against South Florida, if you do what you're supposed to do, I think we'll see multiple quarterbacks in that game. I thought it was telling that, Nick Saban was honest and said that he did consider pulling Milroe. And to me, that means that the door is open a little bit there. And so I think that they need to figure out what's the best case scenario if Jalen as their quarterback, and how do they best utilize his skill set. And if he's not the guy, then consider other options. I mean, I've kind of you and I kind of disagree in this area. I was of the belief that Jalen, I thought, had the highest floor of any of their options, but I thought some other guys might have higher ceilings. And I do wonder, as the season goes on, if you feel like, hey man, like we're just kind of limited in some ways, like maybe we need to take a bigger swing. Is that a Simpson, a Buckner, or something like that? I think that will be an interesting conversation moving forward. But, we kind of said that they need to, try to have their quarterback situation figured out by Texas. I think coming out of it, Jalen's still obviously the guy, but I'm questioning it more. I think that to me, and I wrote this in the past, like to me, the biggest question was always not who started week one, but who starts the last game. And I think that's even more in question for me right now, who ends up starting against Auburn in the Iron Bowl. So that's a big question, I think, moving forward. And so you got to just figure out, they obviously want to be more of a running team. You can do that to some extent. They had some success. Is that enough to beat South Florida? I think it is. Is that enough to beat Ole Miss? Probably. Is it enough to beat Mississippi State? Yeah. I think A&M, even having to lose to Miami, is going to be tough. And then, Tennessee, LSU, Auburn, like those are all going to be really tough games. And I just don't think what we saw last night is good enough to go undefeated the rest of the season. I like that. The team that we saw last night, even acknowledging how good Texas is, I think they're a legitimate college football playoff contender. But I still think we saw enough flaws from Alabama last night that probability-wise, and I don't care what ESPN's FPI says, but to me, the Talty probability is that there's probably another loss in the schedule unless there's some big fixes that are made. And I think that you just have to figure out, all right, if we're chalking up that our offensive line is just not going to be good in pass pro, then we need to figure out ways to move Jalen around outside the pocket or whatever it might be. There has to be some adjustments there because what they did last night, like what got them there is not going to get them there, and I think that's going to be the big concern moving forward.
Yeah, I'll be very curious to see how they use the quarterbacks at South Florida. I'll be very curious to see how they just evolve. Like I think you hit on it. Like they don't know, or at least they have what we've seen so far. It doesn't look like they know what they want to be offensively, which is wild when you've got three quarterbacks who, varying levels of passing ability, but all of them are mobile, right? To certain extents. I know Milroe's got a lot of speed, but Simpson and Buckner have both shown the ability to run the ball. You've got experienced receivers. Productivity is up to, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And then you've got a deep tight end room that I know that they're very, very excited about, especially a guy like Amari Niblack, who, has very clearly come along. There are offenses that even the dumbest football fan can be like, yeah, like there's a way to do this if you don't fully trust the offensive line. Like implement that, do that. I wonder if they'll do that against South Florida or if we'll start to see the beginnings of that because I don't know. They were so much better than Middle Tennessee that we didn't need to see that in week one. But then you could just tell last night that they were just, even late in the third quarter, all the way through the fourth quarter, like it would just look like desperation play after desperation play. And it's like, no, like if you've got like a system that you're good with and that your quarterback's going to excel in, like you should still be able to do that in the fourth quarter. And they just weren't doing that at all. And it was jarring. It was really weird. I'll keep coming back to that. I was really flabbergasted by the lack of help that the offensive line and Milroe specifically got from the coaching staff last night. Just super, super bizarre. Super bizarre.
And I think for me, like the biggest difference, and it's just so obvious, but it's a feeling like no matter what happened the last 2 years when Alabama went down, and they went down, by some significant chunks at times, like I just always felt like Bryce was going to find a way to win. And he didn't always win, but you always felt like he was going to be able to do something. Whereas, even when Alabama is down 3 points, 6 points, like I'm thinking, how is Jalen going to win this? Like it just, my mind is so flipped, and that like just because of some of the lack of identity and just not trusting some of what I was seeing out there, just like, man, like it almost feels like they need some crazy things to happen to win this game. Even then when they weren't, down by 10 points, I was like, yeah, this game's over, and it's just like, it shouldn't feel that way, but just the way that Texas was able to put up points and the way that Alabama seemed to, struggle to be consistent, that was, interesting, just, I don't know, just change. And, the other thing too, and again, I don't pretend to be a smart football guy, but I do wonder if it seems like they want to be more of a ground and pound type. And that seems to be all the offseason hype. And they've made such a huge deal about how big all the offensive linemen are. And, I wonder if that's, there's some pass pro issues there because the guys are big and they should be, maulers, but like some of those guys just don't seem to be, particularly agile on their feet and moving. I don't know, it just felt like, is that a little bit of a liability of having all these guys who are 350 plus that as big as they are, that they don't maybe move as well. And that might be some of the issues and that we saw in pass pro. I don't know. It's just something to think about moving forward. If they do want to be ground and pound, that's great. I think they have the offensive line in theory to do it, but yeah, that might be some other issues in the pass protection area.
Yeah, no, I think that'll be interesting to watch, on the rewatch, because last week's rewatch, Caden Proctor specifically, like true freshman, he didn't look like a glaring liability against Middle Tennessee, but he's a true freshman. He won some reps. He lost some reps last night. Again, he won some reps. He lost some reps. He lost significantly more than he won. I think at least on first watch, I'll be curious to kind of see, but like, he wasn't the only one either, like Seth McLaughlin, that was his, 24th career game, 13th career start, 14th career start, something like that. And he got blown up through the middle, and that's when you're going up against Tavondre Sweat, who Eli Gold called the Great Wall of China, effectively. Mm-hmm. Like that's, like it was always going to be a tough assignment, but I guess I was taken aback by how much they ultimately struggled, given how much they've talked about wanting to dominate and physically, intimidate people and, ultimately make people quit. And, you look at the stats and you look at the way it played out. It looked like Alabama's offensive line was the unit that quit last night. So yeah, I'm really curious to kind of see all of that on the rewatch. Anything else that really we've been kind of rambling, but not really a through line here, but anything else that really kind of immediately jumped out thinking about last night's game?
No, I think that's the big thing. I mean, I think Nick Saban is always very good handling losses. We saw that again last night. I think it's just, you know, I keep kind of, and I wrote a column about this, so it's why I keep coming back to it. But I mean, there was just a lot of talk this offseason, and I think that's, so far proven inaccurate. I think everybody said all the right things last night. Every player was handling it well, talking about, how they're going to move forward. All of that was great. If you're a fan and you want to be optimistic, everything that every player that I was around and everything Nick Saban said would make you feel good that, hey, we're going to get this figured out. It's just, as Nick Saban said, it's just the midterm, not the final. I'm on board with that. I get it. Well, let's see what they do against South Florida, because an old school Alabama team coming off a loss would put a beat down on South Florida, and they have the talent to put a beat down on South Florida. And this is a team that went 1-11 last year. So I'm just kind of like, I'm going to go into full journalist, skeptic, cynic mode on this team right now. Like, I want to show it to me, prove it to me, beat up on South Florida, beat up on Ole Miss, and then I'll start buying into it again. But right now, I think that I'm just skeptical based on what we thought we knew coming into this game, and then what we think we know right now coming out of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fair. I think the version of Alabama that we saw last night, with an opportunity to play against a team that, on paper just as talented, and then when you see them live, like, very clearly Texas is a playoff caliber team. Alabama did not rise to that same level, and they did not rise to that challenge. At least when it mattered most. So, no, I'm in full agreement. Does this Alabama team have the talent to get to the playoff and do what they want to do this season still? Yes, all of that is still in front of them, but got to see it. Got to see it. Same thing we were talking about the offensive line last week after Middle Tennessee. Like, you say that you're a bunch of big maulers and you want to beat people up and make people quit. Got to see it. Got to see it. Yeah, I think that's probably it. Appreciate everybody tuning in and listening to us ramble a little bit. We'll be back sometime later in the week, either me and Rodak or me and Brett, or maybe even me and John, discussing the news of the week as well as previewing the game against South Florida. Until then, sure to rate and review the show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify, Bama247's YouTube page. Be sure to subscribe there. Subscribe to 247sports.com. A lot of things to discuss about this Alabama team. We don't want you guys to miss anything, so be sure to check out all of that. Thanks so much for listening, and we will talk again soon.